Hi, and welcome to this talk for Leeds Civic Trust. I'm Emma Storr, and today my topic is the history of the manufacture of the artificial eye, or the ocular prosthesis as it's known in medical language. First, a warning, I'm not going to show you pictures of people missing an eye or go into horrible details about surgical procedures, but I do have several slides of artificial eyes to show you, made from various materials. So if you're at all squeamish, please don't continue with this illustrated talk. I'm going to start with a bit of background and statistics before discussing the history of the manufacture of artificial eyes that actually goes back thousands of years, as well as how ocular prostheses are made today. There's some really exciting new techniques going on in Leeds, which I'll come back to later. And sadly, it's not possible yet to make an artificial eye that actually restores vision. But stem cell research is certainly considering the problem. First of all, an embarrassing story to tell you about when I was a junior doctor at Lewisham Hospital in London in the 1980s. One of the routine examinations we were taught to do at medical school involved shining a torch into the patient's eyes and making sure that the pupils, the black hole in the center of the eye, responded by getting smaller. Various diseases can affect the eyes, and it's significant if one pupil is dilated or a different size to the other eye. Anyway, I put in my notes that the patient's eyes had both reacted to light normally until the medical student gleefully pointed out that this particular man had one glass eye. I was a lot more careful in my examinations after that. But it does show that his artificial eye was so realistic, I hadn't noticed it was different to his normal eye. And in my defense, I was probably sleep deprived, hungry and stressed. I'm sure he did have a glass eye, but this material has now been superseded by acrylic. Of course, the loss of an eye from whatever cause is a very traumatic event. Not only does the person concerned have to cope with the loss of binocular vision, but they also have to come to terms with the change in their appearance. And the impact on their mental health and well-being can be very significant, particularly if they're having to wait a long time for their artificial eye to be made and fitted, a point I'll come back to later. Most of us are very anxious about any condition that affects the face, and in particular the eyes. A lot of romantic literature and poetry emphasize the eyes as being the windows of the soul and crucial to that mysterious business of falling in love. We read people's feelings from looking into their eyes, so when one eye is missing or appears different, it can be unsettling for the observer and upsetting for the person with one eye to witness their reaction. This slide just shows two artificial glass eyes, but also the walking stick that apparently belonged to Charles Darwin, which has these rather gorgeous green glass eyes in. But to go back to patients, so if a patient has had to have surgery for a condition such as cancer or trauma that's affected the face or eye, they may need a prosthesis that replaces the missing part. For example, if they have had cancer of the upper jaw, the maxilla, this bone also forms part of the orbit or the eye socket, so up here. Luckily, great advances in plastic surgery and in prostheses for the face and eye have taken place in recent years. So most patients who've had any sort of facial reconstruction manage extremely well and can be confident about their appearance. And of course, the artificial eye may be just one component in this complicated process. I'm going to move on to just talk about a few statistics to put things into context. So in the UK, about 1,500 people a year have to have an eye removed, and that's often due to trauma or cancer. And overall, it means that there's about 60,000 patients in the UK who have an artificial eye. As I said, trauma and cancer are the main causes of this, but rarely a baby is born with a congenital condition of the eye, or rather an eye that hasn't developed and cannot function. And that means that the baby will need an orbital prosthesis to help fill the empty eye socket and let it develop and grow in as normal a way as possible. As you can imagine, a baby might need a replacement eye every few months as their skull and their eye sockets and facial features develop so rapidly. The National Artificial Eye Service in Blackpool, together with about 30 smaller local artificial eye services linked to hospital maxillo-facial labs, look after patients with artificial eyes. And in Blackpool, they make around 11,500 artificial eyes each year, which are a mix of new and replacement eyes, and they're all hand painted by the ocularists who work there. I'd always imagined an artificial eye was like a marble, but in fact it's more like a curved shell. So after surgery to remove a patient's diseased eye, and when everything has healed, ocular prosthetists create a mold by injecting a sort of dental alginate into the empty socket. And that produces an individual mold which the ocularist can work with over a period of weeks, creating an ocular prosthetic by hand and intricately hand painting an iris to replicate the patient's remaining eye. As you can imagine, this is actually an incredibly skilled process, and it's been going on for centuries and is used worldwide, this hand painting. It requires extreme skill and care to produce such a work of art. And at the moment, manufacture time is around 6 weeks, but it can take much longer, several months in fact, and will involve several visits by the patient for fitting and adjustment. But just to go back to the history of artificial eyes, apparently the first artificial eye was discovered nearly 5,000 years ago and was found in a female buried in Iran. It was very light and probably made of animal fat and natural tar, and it was covered with a fine layer of gold engraved with a central pupil from which radiated tiny gold vessels like the rays of the sun. And in addition to these details, some fragments of white color were found, suggesting that it was once delicately painted to realistically illustrate an eye. And the skeleton herself was a woman of about 30, and she was exceptionally tall, sort of 1.82 meters. So it's presumed that she was a woman of high status. And I bet she looked pretty good with that artificial eye. They also found 2 holes with gold wire on either side of the eyeball, and microscopic research has shown that the eye socket showed clear imprints of the golden thread. So the eyeball must have been worn during this woman's lifetime. I could just imagine her with her gold eye glinting in the light. And we know that in other parts of the ancient world, Roman and Egyptian priests also used painted clay and cloth to fashion a false eye, though these were sometimes worn outside the socket like an eye patch. Now we have to jump forward many hundreds of years and to the 1570s, when a Frenchman, Ambroise PARÉ, described an external artificial eye fastened to the end of a metal rod that bent around the back of the head to keep the eye in place. His first prosthesis was made of gold and silver, but he later improved the design using glass and porcelain, which was a great step forward and eventually resulted in the use of sort of shell-type prostheses instead of spheres. And glass really remained the most popular material until the introduction of synthetic materials in the 20th century. My next slide is of a rather wonderful artificial eye made by Giambattista Verle in 1679, with an ivory anatomical model used for instruction. Apparently, Verlet was an instrument maker, but I couldn't discover if it was musical or scientific instruments he made, or both. And he was helped in his construction of the eye and its model by the professor of anatomy at the University of Padua, which was famous for its anatomy teaching. By the end of the 16th century, the Venetians were making artificial eyes out of glass, but they kept their methods secret and had a monopoly on production until the end of the 18th century, when other centers in Europe developed similar glass blowing techniques. There were further advances made when cryolite glass was manufactured in 1835. And this particular stuff was a composite of arsenic oxide and cryolite, which produced a grayish white color suitable for an artificial eye. To make these glass eyes, a tube of glass was heated on one end until the form of a ball was obtained, and various colors of glass were used like paintbrushes to imitate the natural color of the eye. So by the 19th century, German craftsmen or ocularists began to apparently tour the world, setting up for several days at a time in one city after another, where they fabricated eyes and fitted them to patients. And later on, artificial eyes were also available by mail order. But as you can imagine, it must have been a bit pot luck if your mail order glass eye actually fitted properly. But here's an advert from America suggesting faultless pebbles, a specialty, and artificial human eyes for $4 could be fitted. Many glass eyes were made in Germany, and this continued until World War II, when German goods became unavailable, and surgeons and technicians then started experimenting with other materials. So these days, most orbital prostheses are made of acrylic, though I've been told that glass is actually still used in some parts of Germany today. So to move on to the modern day, and here's the exciting news, a new, faster and potentially more accurate method of manufacturing orbital prostheses using digital photography is being developed here in Leeds by Paul Bartlett, who is head of the Maxillo-Facial prosthetic department, and Tim Zolti, head of medical and dental illustration, both based in Leeds Dental Institute. And they work very closely with teams of surgeons from different specialties. And of course, most importantly, they're working with individual patients. I actually talked to Paul and Tim some years ago about their project and learned that Paul started life as a dental technician, but then he applied for a job in the maxillofacial department in Leeds and became an expert in crafting facial prostheses. And as I mentioned before, a patient who's had surgery for cancer of the jaw or eye might require reconstruction of their face. And this is where maxillofacial plastic surgeons, dentists, and prosthetists work together. Apparently, silicone is the material used to make part of a jaw or eye socket. Tim Zolti is an award-winning photographer and videographer in medicine and dentistry, and his department offers lots of different skills: photography, video, illustration, design, poster printing, and 3D facial imaging. So when I talked to them, they told me about their feasibility study. They got funding to conduct this in 2021 with several other colleagues, looking at the use of digital photography to manufacture artificial eyes, which is a process that's potentially much faster than the hand-painted option. As I mentioned before, the physical and mental trauma of losing an eye can be devastating, and you can imagine it can lead to a lot of anxiety and depression, and returning to normal family, social and work life can be difficult, particularly if the person concerned has to wait a very long time to receive their artificial eye, and attend the clinic on several occasions for fitting and adjustment. This new technique using digital photography can speed up the time patients have to wait for their prostheses and the number of times they would need to attend for fitting. So I spoke to Chief Investigator Dr. Tara Scout as well as Tim Zolte, and in their words, as I've put up on the screen, our overall aim is to create a more lifelike artificial eye in order to improve patients' initial rehabilitation pathway, long-term quality of life, and service experience. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the technique on my next slide. So digital photography can provide patients with an artificial eye that's even closer in color and characteristics to their normal eye than one that's been painted. And it involves taking several photographs of the patient's normal eye from different angles and then using special software to merge the images and provide one exact replica. It's important that the white of the eye, the sclera, is reproduced accurately with all those tiny little blood vessels, as well as the colored part of the eye, the iris. This image is then sent to a 2D printer, which transfers it onto special paper that can then be fixed onto the individually molded acrylic shell that forms the patient's artificial eye. I'm not going to go into huge technical detail, but various problems can arise during this process of photography to do with the dyes and pigments used in the printer. And of course, it's crucial that the colors transferred from the camera to the printer, then to the paper and to the acrylic shell remain static and reproducible at every stage. So that's why colleagues from the chemistry department at the University of Leeds are also involved in the feasibility study, looking at the different properties of dyes and pigments, such as their longevity and drift, that is, whether they fade or change over time. As a patient, you don't want to find your prosthetic eye has changed color and no longer matches your other eye. And I didn't really understand before talking to them about the difference between dyes and pigments, but apparently dyes are soluble, whereas pigments are insoluble. So a little bit more about the study. It's been carried on and is now actually finished, and the recruitment of the 35 patients involved in this study in Leeds and enrolled was carried out with the help of two charities in particular, the Royal Institute of Blind People and the Blind Veterans UK. So all these people who agreed to be in the study already had an artificial eye and were in need of a replacement, which can be necessary every couple of years. They were randomly selected as to which artificial eye type they hand painted or printed they were given first. And once they had worn the first eye for 2 weeks, they then wore the other type. And before and after wearing each artificial eye, they were asked to fill out a questionnaire to assess how satisfied they were with each eye, how it affected their confidence and well-being. Some patients and their family members were also interviewed to get a better understanding of their experiences. And the results of this study will be published once the trial is complete, probably in October of this year. So research interest into artificial eye production is increasing, but Leeds' approach is novel because they're photographing and producing a replica of the whole eye, not just the coloured iris. It's too early to know how long these newer prosthetic eyes produced by digital photography will last, but Paul and Tim anticipate several years worth of wear. And Tim also foresees a time when artificial intelligence will be able to manufacture bespoke prostheses, perhaps using images sent by patients using their mobile phone camera or a tablet device to photograph their remaining eye and upload it to a printer remotely, which is an extraordinary idea and very exciting. Finally, some of you may remember the story of Simon Brown from Morley, a veteran from the Iraq War who lost one eye and has only 10% vision left in his remaining eye. In 2018, he was traveling from Leeds to London on the train, and he mislaid his precious collection of 16 artificial eyes en route. And Simon was particularly keen to replace 2 of the designs special to him, a cat's eye and one featuring the Morley coat of arms. I'm glad to say Paul Bartlett, involved in the feasibility study, and the head maxillo-facial prosthetist, came to his rescue and offered to make Simon some new eyes. So you can see a selection of these on this slide. And aren't the designs and details incredible? So you can have fun with your design for the artificial eye, as well as having one that mimics your other eye. So I have to admit, I didn't know much about artificial eyes or orbital prostheses before I started researching this program. And I've been very impressed by the attention to detail shown by those involved in making artificial eyes, whether they're using hand painting or digital photography. It's also wonderful that such exciting new developments in prosthetics are taking place here in Leeds. So in summary, the oldest artificial eye discovered dates back to almost 5,000 years ago, and it was found in Iran. Artificial eyes have been made of many different materials over the centuries: clay, ivory, porcelain, glass, and now acrylic mainly. And some prostheses were worn actually outside of the eye socket. But during the 16th century and onwards, skilled craftsmen in Venice and Germany particularly could produce glass eyes of different colors, and glass really stayed there for many centuries before we developed acrylic. The National Artificial Eye Hospital in Blackpool was established during the First World War to treat injured soldiers who'd lost an eye, and that continued during the Second World War until 1948, when I'm glad to say the service was incorporated into the NHS and became available to everyone needing an orbital prosthesis, not just service personnel and war pensioners. And artificial eyes made here are hand painted with enormous skill, and that continues. But there are new techniques using digital photography to produce a lifelike artificial eye quickly and accurately, and that's being pioneered at Leeds Dental Institute by Paul Bartlett and Tim Zolty and other colleagues, which is a very exciting new thing. I have lots of references, and most of the images I used came from the Wellcome Institute, but here are some of them. Thank you very much.